Grandpa, what were you hiding down here? That ledger was telling the truth all along. Everything changes today.
You think you know what your family leaves behind. A dusty house, maybe some debt. But when I cracked the concrete beneath my grandfather's rotting shed, I didn't find old tools. I found a steel vault. 10 minutes later, 3 black SUVs boxed me in. The nightmare had just begun. Thomas Harrison sat at his chipped Formica kitchen table, staring at a stack of final notices that seemed to multiply in the dark. At 32, Thomas felt like a man walking underwater. His graphic design business had flatlined, his mother's medical bills had drained his meager savings, and the only thing standing between him and absolute bankruptcy was a half-acre of overgrown weeds on the edge of town. It was the last remaining asset of his late grandfather, Elias Harrison. Everyone in the family hated that lot. It sat like a jagged, ugly tooth in the middle of a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in suburban Pennsylvania. The grass was waist-high, choked with briars and rusted car parts, and dead center sat a sagging, weather-beaten wooden shed that looked like a stiff breeze would turn it to splinters. For the past 6 months, Thomas had been hounded relentlessly by Clayton Miller, the aggressive lead acquisition agent for Oak Haven Real Estate Development. Clayton was the kind of man who wore custom-tailored suits to construction sites and smiled only when he was about to ruin someone's life. Oak Haven was building a massive, multi-million-dollar luxury condominium complex right next door, and Elias's empty lot was the final piece of the puzzle. Clayton needed it for an access road. Without it, the entire development faced a logistical nightmare. The offers had started at a reasonable $50,000, but as Thomas hesitated, paralyzed by a strange, stubborn loyalty to his grandfather's memory, Clayton's tactics had turned vicious. The offers dropped instead of rising. Clayton pulled strings at City Hall, burying Thomas in municipal code violations, uncut grass fines, structural hazard citations for the shed, soil runoff penalties. The fines were compounding weekly, currently sitting at just over $14,000. Clayton's latest offer, delivered via certified mail that very morning, was a brutal $15,000. It was just enough to cover the fines and leave Thomas with $1,000 and a broken spirit. Thomas's phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID flashed Aunt Brenda. Thomas let out a long, exhausted sigh and picked it up. "Thomas, tell me you signed the papers." Brenda's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and impatient. "I'm looking at them right now, Aunt Brenda," Thomas muttered, rubbing his temples. "Look at them while you sign your name, Tommy. Are you out of your mind? You're drowning. The city is going to seize that dirt pit for unpaid taxes and fines by the end of the month, and then you get nothing." Elias was a paranoid old fool. He held on to that garbage patch because he thought the government was going to build a highway through it. There is no highway. There is only Clayton Miller, and you are entirely out of your depth. "It just feels wrong," Thomas argued weakly. "Grandpa made me promise not to let it go to the developers. He explicitly wrote it in that weird letter he left me." Elias also wrote letters to the local news, claiming the water supply was being poisoned by corporate spies. Brenda snapped. He was a hoarder who lived in a fantasy world. Do you want to lose your apartment out of some misplaced loyalty to a man who buried his own spare tires because he thought rubber was going to become a currency? Sign the paper, Thomas. Let Clayton Miller bulldoze that hideous shed and move on with your life. She hung up, leaving a dial tone echoing in the quiet kitchen. Thomas looked down at the contract. The glossy white paper seemed to mock him. On the last page, a neon sticky note from Clayton read, "Signed by Friday at 5 p.m., Thomas, or the offer drops to zero and we let the city auction it. Your choice." It was Thursday evening. The sky outside his window was already turning the bruised purple of an incoming summer storm. Thomas grabbed a pen. He clicked it once, twice. The tip hovered over the dotted line. He needed the debt gone. He needed to breathe again. But an irritating, persistent voice in the back of his mind, sounding remarkably like old Elias, nagged at him. "They don't want the dirt, Tommy. They want what the dirt hides." Thomas threw the pen across the room. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Not without looking inside that shed one last time. He grabbed his keys, an industrial flashlight, and a pair of heavy work gloves. If he was going to surrender his grandfather's legacy to a corporate shark like Clayton Miller, he was at least going to clean it out himself. The air at the lot was thick with humidity and the sweet, rotting smell of damp vegetation. Thomas parked his beat-up sedan on the curb, ignoring the glaring security lights from the towering, half-finished Oak Haven condo construction site looming directly next door. The contrast was staggering. On one side, sleek steel and polished glass. On the other, waist-high thistles and Elias's decaying wooden shack. Thomas waded through the weeds, the thorns catching on his denim jeans. He reached the shed. A heavy, rusted master lock secured the doors. Thomas didn't have the key. Elias had died 3 years ago, and whatever keys he possessed had long been lost in the chaotic aftermath of his estate. Thomas retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from his trunk. He jammed the wedged end behind the hasp and threw his weight into it. With a sharp crack, the rotting wood splintered, and the padlock fell to the dirt. He pulled the doors open. A cloud of ancient dust and the sharp scent of mildew billowed out. Thomas clicked on his flashlight, cutting a beam through the darkness. It was exactly as he remembered, wall-to-wall junk. Stacks of yellowed newspapers from the 1980s, rusted coffee cans filled with bent nails, broken garden tools, a dismantled lawnmower engine, and a massive, heavy oak workbench bolted to the back wall. It was the tragic accumulation of a man who believed everything could be fixed, yet fixed nothing. Thomas spent the next 3 hours hauling bags of trash out to the curb. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. The physical labor was oddly cathartic, a distraction from his impending financial doom. By midnight, the shed was mostly empty, save for the massive oak workbench. He approached the bench. It was covered in a thick layer of grease and sawdust. Thomas grabbed his crowbar, intending to pry the heavy drawers loose to lighten the frame before dragging it out. As he swung the steel bar, it slipped from his sweaty grip, plummeting to the floor. Thud! Thomas froze. The crowbar hadn't hit the dirt floor with a dull, muffled thwack. It had struck the ground and echoed, a hollow, resonant, metallic clank that reverberated up through Thomas's boots. He stared at the ground. The floor of the shed appeared to be nothing but hard-packed earth and scattered sawdust. He knelt down, using the side of his heavy flashlight to brush away the top layer of dirt. A half-inch below the surface, his light caught a dull, grayish reflection. Wood, not dirt. Thomas's heart began to beat a little faster. He grabbed his crowbar and frantically scraped away more dirt, coughing as the dust filled the cramped space. He uncovered a seam, then another. He had found a trapdoor, measuring roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, cleverly disguised beneath a layer of packed soil and resin to blend in with the ground. Panting, Thomas wedged the crowbar into the tight seam. He threw his entire body weight backward. The wood groaned, protesting after years of neglect. With a violent snap, the heavy oak hatch gave way, flying backward on rusted iron hinges. Thomas fell onto his back, gasping for air. He scrambled up on his knees and directed the flashlight beam into the dark, gaping square in the floor. It wasn't a root cellar. It wasn't a septic tank. 5 feet down, sitting at the bottom of a concrete-lined shaft, was a pristine, heavy steel door, resembling the entry to a ship's bulkhead. In the center of the steel door was a heavy industrial turn wheel. "What in the hell, Grandpa?" Thomas whispered to the empty shed. He lowered himself into the tight concrete shaft. It was shockingly cold down there, the earth acting as a natural insulator. The steel door was coated in a thin layer of grease, preserving the metal from rust. Thomas gripped the wheel with both gloved hands. He expected it to be seized solid, but Elias, ever the meticulous machinist, had maintained the mechanism perfectly before he died. With a grinding shriek of metal, the wheel turned. 1 full rotation. 2. A heavy internal deadbolt clacked back into its housing. Thomas grabbed the handle and heaved upward. The door was incredibly heavy, assisted only by 2 thick hydraulic struts that hissed as the door swung open, revealing a second, larger chamber directly beneath the shed. Thomas shined his light inside. The space was about the size of a single-car garage, reinforced with thick concrete pillars. But it wasn't empty. Stacked meticulously against the far wall were dozens of olive-drab military surplus canvas bags. In the center of the room sat a massive, fireproof Mosler safe, the kind used in mid-century bank vaults, alongside a folding metal table stacked with moldering cardboard file boxes. Trembling, Thomas climbed down the small metal ladder into the vault. He approached the closest canvas bag. It was small, but impossibly heavy. He untied the frayed paracord holding it shut and tipped it over. A half-dozen dull silver-gray bricks tumbled out, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. Thomas dropped to his knees. He picked one up. It weighed about 7 pounds. He rubbed his thumb across the dusty surface, revealing a stamped insignia. United States Assay Office, 999, fine silver, 100 troy ounces. There were at least 40 bags. Thomas couldn't breathe. His mind raced, calculating the math. At current market prices, 100 ounces of silver was worth roughly $2,000 to $3,000, with dozens of bags holding multiple bars each. Thomas was looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw bullion. But Elias hadn't been a rich man. He had lived on a meager pension and Social Security. Where did a paranoid, retired machinist get a king's ransom in silver bullion? Thomas scrambled over to the fireproof safe. The dial was locked, but sitting perfectly centered on the steel top was a small black leather ledger book. Thomas opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Elias's, sharp, cramped, and entirely capitalized. Entry: the 14th of October 1998. Vanguard Bank liquidation complete. They think they hid the paper trail. They didn't. I have the master deeds. I have the bearer bonds. If Miller wants Oakhaven, he has to bleed for it. I hid the collateral where they can't legally touch it without admitting federal fraud. Thomas's blood ran cold. Miller. He flipped a page. Entry: the 3rd of November 2002. Clayton's father, Arthur, died today. The son is taking over. He's looking for the Oakhaven parcel deeds. He doesn't know the entire Eastside development is built on defaulted land. If the city finds out Vanguard never legally owned the tracks, the whole company burns. The silver is just a distraction. The papers in this safe are the real bomb. Thomas staggered back, dropping the ledger onto the table. Clayton Miller hadn't been trying to buy the empty lot to build an access road. He was trying to buy the lot to bury a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. He knew Elias had hidden the evidence here, and he had been trying to legally seize the land before anyone found out. Thomas had to get the silver and the ledger out. Tonight. Right now. He grabbed the nearest bag of silver, hoisted it over his shoulder, and began climbing the ladder. He threw the heavy bag onto the dirt floor of the shed, rushing back down for a second one. Adrenaline surged through his veins, masking the exhaustion. He was halfway up the ladder with the third bag when the darkness outside the shed vanished. The entire lot was suddenly flooded with blinding, high-intensity halogen lights. Thomas froze on the ladder, shielding his eyes as the blinding glare pierced through the open doors of the shed. The heavy crunch of gravel and the low hum of powerful engines filled the night air. "Thomas Harrison!" a voice boomed through a megaphone, metallic and commanding. "Step out of the shed with your hands visible!" Panic seized Thomas's throat like a physical hand. He dropped the bag of silver back into the vault and scrambled up the rest of the ladder, his boots slipping on the rungs. He crawled over the edge of the trapdoor, his chest heaving, and stumbled toward the shed's entrance. Squinting against the blinding glare, Thomas saw 3 sleek black Cadillac Escalades parked in a wedge formation across his grandfather's overgrown lawn. Their headlights were on high beams, supplemented by a mounted spotlight from the lead vehicle. Standing in the center of the illumination, flanked by 2 men who looked less like security guards and more like mercenaries, was Clayton Miller. Even at 2 a.m., standing in a muddy, weed-choked lot, Clayton wore a pristine charcoal suit. But Clayton wasn't the one holding the megaphone. Beside him stood a tall, impossibly rigid man with silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, wearing a tailored navy trench coat. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and the megaphone in the other. "Who the hell are you?" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "Get off my property! You're trespassing!" The silver-haired man lowered the megaphone. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried perfectly through the humid night air. "I am Theodore Briggs, Senior Litigation Counsel for Vanguard Holdings and the Miller Trust. And as of 45 minutes ago, Mr. Harrison, this property is no longer yours. You are the one trespassing." Thomas gripped the doorframe of the shed, his knuckles turning white. "That's a lie! I own this land! The deed is in my name! I never signed your garbage contract." Clayton Miller stepped forward, a cruel, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "You didn't have to, Tommy. You let the clock run out. You owed the city $14,000 in compounding municipal fines. At midnight, a judge granted an emergency municipal lien execution. The city seized the lot, and Oakhaven Development immediately purchased the deed from the county to clear the debt. It's public record. You're standing on my dirt." Thomas felt the earth tilt beneath him. "A judge? At midnight? That's impossible. You bribed a judge." "Careful, Mr. Harrison," Briggs, the lawyer, warned smoothly, stepping forward. "Slander is an ugly charge to add to criminal trespass and theft." "Theft?" Thomas spat, stepping out of the shed. "It's my grandfather's shed. Everything in here belongs to my family." "Actually," Briggs said, popping the latches on his briefcase and pulling out a sheaf of legal documents sealed in plastic. "We have reason to believe that Elias Harrison was in possession of stolen corporate property, specifically, assets misappropriated from the Vanguard Bank liquidation in 1998, bullion, and sensitive corporate records. My client has spent over 2 decades tracking these stolen assets. They knew. Clayton had known all along. The lowball offers, the municipal fines, the harassment, it was a targeted siege, perfectly executed to strip Thomas of the land without triggering a deeper investigation into what was buried beneath it. "You can't do this," Thomas breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You can't just take it. I found it. It's his." "Elias was a thief and a lunatic," Clayton said, stepping closer, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud. "He stole from my father. He caused my family decades of legal headaches. I'm just taking back what's mine. Now, step aside, Thomas. You've lost. Go back to your graphic design and your medical debt. If you walk away right now, Vanguard won't press charges against you for attempting to fence stolen bullion." Thomas looked at Clayton. Then he looked at Briggs. He looked at the two muscle-bound security men who were already pulling heavy-duty flashlights from their belts, preparing to march into the shed and secure the vault. Inside that vault was enough silver to change Thomas's life forever. But more importantly, inside that safe was the ledger. The proof. Elias hadn't stolen anything. Elias had uncovered a massive structural fraud committed by the Miller family, a fraud that built their entire real estate empire. The stolen assets were the smoking gun Clayton desperately needed to destroy. Thomas realized in that terrifying instant that if Clayton Miller got his hands on that ledger, the truth would be incinerated before the sun came up, and Thomas would spend the rest of his life paying off debts while Clayton built penthouses on stolen land. "You want the shed?" Thomas asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a dangerous, deadly calm. "Smart boy," Clayton smirked, waving his men forward. "Go in and secure the hatch." "No," Thomas said. He reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapped around a sleek, heavy piece of metal he had grabbed from Elias's workbench an hour ago. It wasn't a weapon. It was an antique brass Zippo lighter. Thomas flicked his thumb. The spark wheel ground against the flint, and a bright orange flame danced in the dark. Clayton stopped walking. Briggs went rigid. "Thomas, don't be stupid," Clayton warned, his voice losing its cocky edge. Thomas backed up into the doorway of the shed. He lowered the lighter toward the floorboards, right next to a massive puddle of dark, thick liquid he had accidentally spilled while clearing the shed earlier. It was ancient, highly flammable lacquer thinner from Elias's workbench. "You guys really should have checked the structural hazard citations you filed against me," Thomas said, his eyes locking onto Clayton's. "You cited this shed for having unsafe, improperly stored combustible chemicals. You were right." "Harrison, stop!" Briggs shouted, dropping his briefcase. "You destroy those documents, you destroy yourself." "If I can't have it, neither can Vanguard," Thomas said. He dropped the lighter. The fumes caught instantly. A blinding wall of blue and orange flame erupted across the floor of the shed with a concussive whoosh, instantly igniting the dry, rotting wood of the walls. The heat was instantaneous and ferocious, throwing Thomas backward. Clayton screamed as the flames created an impassable wall of fire between the corporate thugs and the trapdoor. The security men scrambled back, throwing their arms over their faces. "Put it out! Put it out!" Clayton shrieked, panic finally breaking his polished facade. But Thomas didn't stick around to watch. He knew the fire wouldn't breach the concrete vault below, at least not immediately, but it would completely prevent Miller's men from accessing the trapdoor tonight. More importantly, a 3-story bonfire in the middle of a city block was going to attract the one thing Clayton Miller could not control, bribe, or intimidate in the middle of the night: sirens. In the distance, the wail of Oak Haven fire trucks and police cruisers began to pierce the night. Thomas backed away into the shadows of the weeds, clutching something tightly inside his jacket. When he had climbed the ladder the second time, he hadn't just brought up a bag of silver. He had brought up the black ledger. As the shed roared into an inferno, casting demonic, dancing shadows across Clayton Miller's horrified face, Thomas slipped away into the darkness. The war for the dirt was over. The war for Vanguard's empire had just begun. Thomas ran until his lungs burned and his legs went numb. He didn't stop until he was 3 miles away, huddled under the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Motor Inn on the wrong side of the interstate. He paid for a room using the last $80 in his checking account, bolted the flimsy wooden door, and collapsed onto the sagging mattress. He smelled heavily of gasoline, smoke, and sweat. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely operate the zipper on his jacket. Reaching inside, he pulled out the 2 items he had managed to extract from the vault: a single heavy canvas bag containing 600-ounce silver bars and Elias's black leather ledger. He dumped the silver onto the bed. The dull gray brick sank heavily into the cheap mattress. At current market value, he was looking at roughly $15,000. It was enough to run, but not enough to hide forever. Clayton Miller was a man who possessed limitless resources and zero morality. If Thomas just disappeared with a fraction of the silver, Clayton would hunt him to the ends of the earth. Thomas picked up the ledger. He opened the cracked leather cover, the spine creaking in the quiet room. For the next 4 hours, as the sun began to peek over the industrial skyline, Thomas read through 20 years of his grandfather's obsessive, meticulous espionage. Elias Harrison hadn't been a crazy hoarder. He had been a patient, brilliant ghost. Before his retirement, Elias had been the chief machinist and union representative for a massive steel manufacturing plant on the edge of town. When the plant went bankrupt in 1998, thousands of workers lost their pensions overnight. The liquidation was handled by a private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings, founded by Arthur Miller, Clayton's father. The official story was that the pension fund was empty, devastated by bad market investments. But Elias's ledger told a vastly different, horrifying story. According to the meticulously documented bank routing numbers, forged signatures, and internal corporate memos Elias had somehow intercepted and transcribed, the pension fund hadn't evaporated. It had been systematically drained and laundered through offshore shell companies. That stolen money was then used by Vanguard Holdings to quietly buy up hundreds of acres of distressed suburban real estate. Elias had tracked the money straight through the accounts of J.P. Morgan Chase, identifying the exact escrow accounts used to wash the stolen pension funds. He had even documented how Vanguard had manipulated audits from Deloitte by creating phantom liabilities on their balance sheets. Oak Haven Development, the multi-million-dollar luxury condo project Clayton was currently building, was being constructed on land purchased with stolen blue-collar pensions. Elias had discovered the fraud, stolen the master deeds and bearer bonds from Arthur Miller's private office during a contractor dispute, and buried them beneath his shed to use as leverage. He had bought the silver bullion using a hidden cash settlement he forced Arthur to pay, hiding it as a final insurance policy. Elias had been waiting for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine on the Miller family, but a sudden, fatal heart attack 3 years ago had taken him before he could pull the trigger. Now, the trigger belonged to Thomas. His cell phone vibrated violently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed a restricted number. Thomas stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text message arrived. The fire department found the trapdoor, Thomas, but the vault was empty. You took something that doesn't belong to you. You have 2 hours to bring the book to the Oakhaven site. If you don't, I will have the police issue a warrant for grand larceny and arson. Your mother's medical care facility will be my next phone call. Do not test me. C. Miller. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Clayton was threatening his mother. The corporate shark was backed into a corner and lashing out. If Clayton got to the nursing home, he could easily use his influence to have Thomas's mother evicted, or worse, tie up her care in endless legal injunctions. Thomas couldn't fight this locally. Clayton owned the city judges. He had proven that with the midnight lien execution. Thomas needed a hammer big enough to smash Vanguard Holdings into dust. He packed the silver and the ledger into a duffel bag, left the motel, and walked 2 miles to a pawn shop that opened at 8 a.m. He slid one of the 100-ounce silver bars across the scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker, a heavily tattooed man with suspicious eyes, tested it with nitric acid, weighed it, and handed Thomas $2,400 in untraceable $20 bills. Thomas used the cash to buy a prepaid burner phone and a cheap laptop from a big-box electronics store. Sitting in the back booth of a crowded diner, using their public Wi-Fi, Thomas went to work. He bypassed local law enforcement entirely. He navigated straight to the website of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. Under the Dodd-Frank Act, the SEC operated a highly aggressive whistleblower office, designed specifically to take down massive corporate financial frauds. Thomas filled out the TCR, tips, complaints, and referrals form online. He didn't hold back. He uploaded photographs of the ledger pages detailing the J.P. Morgan Chase routing numbers, the dummy corporations in Delaware, and the exact paper trail linking the 1,998 pension theft to the current Oakhaven real estate development. At the bottom of the form, he typed a single sentence. The CEO of Vanguard Holdings is actively attempting to recover the physical evidence of this fraud using armed mercenaries, and my life is in immediate danger. He hit submit. Now, all he could do was wait. He drank terrible diner coffee for 3 hours, watching every black car that drove past the window with a spike of sheer paranoia. At 1:14 p.m., the burner phone rang. Thomas Harrison? A deep, calm voice asked. Who is this? Thomas replied, his hand gripping the edge of the table. My name is Agent David Henderson. I'm an investigator with the SEC's Division of Enforcement, operating out of the Philadelphia Regional Office. I'm looking at the photographs you submitted. Are you in possession of the original physical ledger? I am, Thomas said, exhaling a shaky breath. And Clayton Miller's lawyers are hunting me for it right now. Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Harrison, Henderson said, his tone shifting from bureaucratic to strictly tactical. If the routing numbers in these photographs are authentic, you are holding the key to a $300 million securities fraud investigation we have been trying to crack for a decade. Do not go home. Do not contact local police. I am dispatching a federal transport team to your location right now. Where are you? Thomas gave him the address of the diner. Sit tight. And Thomas, Henderson added, if anyone in a suit walks into that diner before we get there, you run. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the plush, glass-walled conference room of the downtown Marriott was suffocatingly tense. Thomas sat at the long mahogany table, wearing a borrowed suit that fit him a little too loose. His hands were folded on the table to hide their shaking. Beneath his crisp white shirt, a flat, high-fidelity microphone was taped directly to his sternum. The door swung open.